is the third time I've been able to come and be a part of this summer series, and I'm always appreciative of the invitation. You mentioned my name, Brad Sullivan. He didn't tell you that I traveled a long way to get here, about 10 miles from the house to the building here. Uh, but I do like to travel more than 10 miles. I like to go other places. I've been able to go to Jamaica back when I was in college. I went to St. Vincent, which is a nice small little island down in the Caribbean. Both times were preaching trips, and enjoyed the opportunity to teach the gospel. They're really just starting to learn things at that point. I've been able to go to Kenya a few times, and I've always enjoyed my time there, and a lot of good work is being done all over the world. But we want to make sure that we're also doing work where we live. And I'm always thankful for opportunities to preach the gospel wherever I am. There was a time that when it came to traveling, there were places I might want to go, but the Bible lands was not really on my radar. That wasn't, even though I was a Christian, it wasn't a place that was at the top of the list of places that I might want to travel. I knew that a lot had changed. You couldn't really go there and see the exact same things that you would have seen in the first century. And so it just never dawned on me that it would be a place that would be not just interesting, but helpful in my understanding of God's Word, until I began to study a little bit deeper with the invention of the internet, and that opens up a whole new world to travel. I might not be able to get on an airplane, but I can get on my computer and I can go to other places. And what I have found is that being in the Bible land, seeing the places, even if it's just on a map, it really does enhance your understanding and your remembrance of the things that are taking place. If I told you a story about the place I grew up in South Carolina, a little town called Fairplay, I doubt there's anybody here that knows where that is. But I could tell you about growing up in Fairplay and driving over to Townville, and then maybe we go to Anderson. And those names mean absolutely nothing to probably most everybody here, because you don't know where they are. You have no idea how far apart they are from one another. And so as I'm telling that story, you might hear some details, but you're not really going to be able to follow me very well. But if I told you about leaving Century and driving to Flomaton and going to Atmore and then turning and going down to Molino, y'all could follow me right around that path. You know exactly where I'm talking about. You know how far apart those places are. And so when it comes to the geography of the Bible, don't dismiss it. Give some attention to it. Use the tools that are available, even if you can't get on a plane and travel over there. Use what you have. There's a lot of misuse of the internet, things that we can get involved with that we shouldn't. But there are a lot of great things we could do as well. And so take those opportunities. And if you were to go, and you can go on YouTube and find videos of walking down what is referred to as the Via della Rosa. You can find a video, and again, if you can't go there in person, you can just walk right along and you can see the sights. And you would see a sign like this along the road. Everywhere that there's an intersection, there would be a sign there that says the Via della Rosa. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm not from there, but that's how I would say it. But I can pronounce what it means. What it means is the road to sorrow. This is thought to be the path that Jesus walked as he went from Pilate's court to Golgotha. Now, I don't know how accurate that is. There's some twists and turns along the way. Tradition sometimes is wrong, but a lot of times they get it right. They have some information that goes back for centuries that gives them understanding and information that helps them to develop their ideas about where things took place. But even if we didn't know that this was the exact route, we understand that somewhere in Jerusalem, somewhere nearby where this road is, Jesus did walk, and Jesus did carry his cross to Calvary. And as we think about the road to sorrow, We might think about the moment when Jesus' cross is laid upon him and he begins to walk, but the story actually begins much earlier than that. We're not going to go all the way back to the beginning. That would be the beginning of before God created anything. Jesus, in Revelation chapter 13, is described as the Lamb slain before the foundation of the world. And so we'd have to go back a long way to get to the beginnings of that road to sorrow. But I want to go back to Luke chapter 9 with you and look at a few things here, beginning in verse 51 of Luke chapter 9. Jesus has been spending his time at this point with his disciples, the 12, trying to prepare them for the time that he is going to leave them. And so he has a lot to say, so he's withdrawing from the crowds, he's spending more time with them. We have just prior to this the story of the Transfiguration, where he takes Peter, James, and John, and what a glorious sight they must have seen there on that mountain. But not long after that, we have here in verse 51, Luke telling us that it came to pass when the time had come for him to be received up, that he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. Now, Jesus has made many trips to Jerusalem. We read about one back in Luke chapter 2. When he was 12 years of age, he and his family went down to celebrate the Passover feast. And you might remember he got left behind on that occasion. Mary and Joseph had to come back and find him. But that's just one of many, many, many journeys to Jerusalem that Jesus would have made from Galilee. But this isn't just another trip to Jerusalem. This is the trip to Jerusalem. Now, this doesn't mean he got on the road and he walked straight to Jerusalem. There's still going to be a few months, up to 6 months before the actual crucifixion, but that's the direction he's headed. That's where he's going. And then you come over to chapter 13, and we find that Jesus, in verse 22, says to his disciples, "Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life." That's not what I want. I want to be in 13. That's in chapter 12. I'm sorry. 13:22. And he went through the cities and villages, teaching and journeying toward Jerusalem. Again, not an uncommon thing for Jesus to be doing. He was always going through the cities and the villages teaching. And if there had been someone in one of these cities or one of these villages that Jesus now was coming and teaching, and they heard that, hey, Jesus is coming, or Jesus is here, and come here, and they might think, well, he's been here before. There are a lot of opportunities like this. I'll wait till the next time. If they're going to wait till the next time, they're going to wait a long time, because this is the last time that he's coming through this region. And so we should understand that there's not always going to be another opportunity. You drop on down to verse 33, Jesus says, "Nevertheless, I must journey today, tomorrow, and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem." So you see, we're getting closer and closer, and Jesus here is getting more pointed. He told his disciples back in chapter 9 what was going to happen when he got to Jerusalem, but he's telling them here again that he is going to perish. It cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem. Notice that the next verse shows us that even though Jesus is going to Jerusalem, he knows he's going to die there, but his heart still longs for these people that he loves so dearly. And so he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing." I wonder how many things that maybe God wants to do for me, but I had not been willing. Jesus here shows that his love and his compassion, it was for everyone in the nation of Israel. He wants to gather them together. He wants to protect them, but they were not willing, and he's not going to force them. And that's something we need to understand. God will not force us to do anything. We're given, I was reading not too long ago, the phrase that we use often, free will, that's actually kind of a redundant phrase, because if you have will, it's got to be free. You're not going to do anything that's against your will, that's not free will. So here we see that God He's put it upon us to choose Him, to love Him, to serve Him. But these were not willing. If you keep looking, you'll find in chapter 19 that Jesus is still going on up to Jerusalem. Luke chapter 19, beginning in verse 28, likewise, as it was also, I'm going to get my pages right here in a minute. Luke chapter 19, verse 28, when he had said this, he went on ahead going up to Jerusalem. And it came to pass, when he had drew near to Bethphage and Bethany, at the mountain called Olivet, that he sent two of his disciples, saying, go into the village opposite you, where as you enter, you will find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat. Loose it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, why are you loosing it? Thus you shall say to him, because the Lord has need of it. So those who were sent went their way and found it just as he had said to them. If you drop on down in verse 35, they brought him to Jesus, and there they threw their clothes on the colt, and they sat Jesus on him. And as he went, many spread their clothes on the road. As he was now drawing near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works they had seen, saying, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the high. We call this the triumphal entry, and it was quite triumphal. The Pharisees are going to tell Jesus to tell his disciples to be quiet. They didn't want those things being said of Jesus, and Jesus says, if I should tell them that, then these stones would cry out. It was a triumphal moment as Jesus comes in. But understand that just by the end of the week, these same people who are shouting, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, are going to be shouting, crucify him, crucify him. Or if they're not there shouting, crucify him, they're standing by doing nothing, but they're certainly not upholding him and praising him as their King. So while it was triumphal and Jesus is coming to accomplish exactly what he had determined to do, it was not as the people thought. If you drop on down just a little bit here, you find again Jesus weeping over the city. Verse 41 saying in verse 42, if you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. The fact is, they're hidden in plain sight. Jesus hadn't hidden anything from the people. He hadn't been teaching in a corner. He hadn't been performing his miracles only for a few select people. His teachings, his signs, everything that pointed to him as the Messiah, the King sent by God to redeem his people, it was right there for them to see. But they had closed their eyes to the truth. And so he tells them in verse 43, the days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you, and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. As Jesus is looking toward the cross, his mind, at least to this point, is not so focused that he's lost sight of these people who are in dire need of salvation, yet they refuse it. And he weeps over the city. He's not weeping about these buildings. He's weeping for the people, the souls that will be lost because they refused the grace that God had sent to them. And so he could have at that point said, well, I'll just go hang out somewhere until the time comes, but he doesn't do that. In verse 45, he goes in to cleanse the temple. In verse 47, he's teaching daily in the temple. But the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people sought to destroy him. While they have rejected him, he's still giving them more and more opportunities to hear the truth, to repent of their sins, to respond to him as they should. When you come to chapter 22 and verse 15, this isn't the first Passover that Jesus has partaken of. This isn't the first Passover that Jesus has partaken of with the 12. But he says of this Passover in Luke 22, verse 15, with fervent desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. This is what many people call the Last Supper. And it would be Jesus' last supper with these men on this earth, in this body, before he is resurrected in his glorified body. But here, I think if I knew this would be the last night, that tomorrow, by this time, I would be dead, that maybe in looking ahead in anticipation of this moment, I wouldn't necessarily be longing for it. I wouldn't be joyful for this occasion. I would want to see it put off maybe. But Jesus says, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Yet Jesus is on the road to sorrow, but he's not deterred by it. And all of the things that we might look at and say, I don't think I could do that. I think I would take a different path. Jesus stayed the course. But now, Jesus is man. And as we continue in Luke chapter 22, we see that it's not as if he's impervious to any of the sufferings and the things that's about to take place, because he prays in the garden, verse 42, saying, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And I've heard brethren try to explain away the cup here and saying, well, he's not talking about his death, because he knows he has to do that in order to save man. And so he surely wouldn't be asking God to take that cup away from him. But I think if you follow that cup, I don't know what else you could make it to be, except for the suffering and the death that he's about to undergo. I think it helps us to understand Hebrews chapter 5 a little bit more. Have you ever wondered when the Hebrew writer talks about Jesus learning obedience, what that means? How did Jesus learn obedience? He's God. God knows obedience, right? Why would he have to learn it? But look at the context of the statement that's made. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8 is what I referenced, but let's start reading in verse 7. Who in the days of his flesh, speaking of Jesus here, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. I might not have that figured out, but I think what the Hebrew writer is showing us there is that Jesus here, when he prays, not your will, but mine be done, Jesus acknowledges that there is a difference in his and the Father's will at this point. And all along, Jesus has been doing the Father's will. That's the purpose that he had been sent. And it didn't bother him to do any of those things. He enjoyed it. He loved it. But now we come to a point where the wills differ. What will Jesus do? There's no question what he's going to do. He's going to do the Father's will. But this is where obedience comes into play. You see, if I'm a child and my mother says, hey, I want you to run into the store, I want you to buy a candy bar and soda and enjoy it, I'm going to do that. I'm not being obedient to her. I'm doing what I want to do. It just so happens that she's asked me to do something I want to do. When the Lord asks me to come and assemble on the first day of the week with my brethren, I do that, and I enjoy that. I don't know where else I would rather be. And so as I do that each Lord's Day, I guess in some sense you could say I'm obeying the command, but it's not hard. There's no conflict. My will is God's will in that regard. But what about when God asks me to do something that I don't want to do? Or maybe something has come up on this Lord's Day that maybe this one time there's something else that maybe I would rather do. Well, now I have an opportunity to learn obedience like our Lord did. Will I do that? Jesus did, and he prayed. And in verse 44, back here in Luke chapter 22, it says, being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Now, on one hand, we don't want to over sensationalize this. I've read things about great sorrow and grief causing people to bleed out At least the New King James doesn't say that's what he did. It says his sweat became like great drops of blood. That's different than saying his sweat became blood. But nevertheless, this is a difficult moment. And why? Well, because of what's just about to happen. Beginning in verse 47, we see that Jesus is going to be arrested. We see in verses 54 through 62, he's going to be denied, which I think is probably going to be one of the most difficult things he's going to face on this night. In verses 63 and following, you have Jesus being mocked, you have him being beaten. And when all of those things are happening, Jesus could have at any moment called down angels from heaven. We sing the song 10,000 angels. He could have called 10,000 angels. It was more than that. There's 12 legions of angels. And he just needed one. One angel, I think, killed 185,000 Syrian soldiers in one whack. Did he even need any angels? Jesus had power himself. And how difficult it would be when somebody strikes him and says, tell us who struck you. I want to be calling names. Maybe even in the right mindset, I would think, well, maybe if I did something now, they would believe. But Jesus knew they wouldn't. And he fulfills the passage that tells us, like a sheep led to the slaughter is silent, so he opened not his mouth. And so he remained silent all throughout this mockery of a trial. He's falsely accused. As we come on down, we see that a murder is preferred before him. We see that he is scourged. Luke doesn't go into great detail about that. I think perhaps in verse 14 when Pilate says, I have examined him in your presence, that there he's referring to the scourging, but we read about that in the other gospel accounts. And I won't take the time tonight, but I think you probably understand what scourging was. Many people didn't make it to the cross. They died under the scourging. Paul didn't, when he was in Philippi about to be beaten, he didn't speak up and say anything. But when the commander was going to examine him under scourging in Acts 21, he spoke up and said, I'm a Roman citizen. Scourging was a dreadful thing, but Jesus endured that, and then finally he was delivered to be crucified. And in verse 26 of Luke 23, now as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. This is a statue that's in Montreal, Canada, that depicts Simon, a Cyrenian, helping Jesus to carry his cross. And up until this point on this night, this is the first thing that even comes close to any kind of act of kindness on Jesus' behalf, that somebody is going to help him to carry his cross to the place where he will die. And if I try to put myself into the story, which I often do, I want to, where would I fit? Which of these characters would I fall in line with? And the answer is probably going to be with the disciples who forsook him and denied him. I would hope that I wouldn't be among those who shouted, crucify him. But if I were given a choice, maybe I would choose Simon. To do something good for our Lord, to carry his cross or to help him carry his cross. But even this, though, I don't know that we could say so much about Simon doing some great thing, because as you read verse 26, it says they laid hold of a certain man and laid the cross on him that he might bear it after Jesus. He didn't come out of the crowd and say, I'll volunteer to help him carry that. He was compelled to carry that. And so while I might look at Simon carrying the cross of Jesus and say that might look something like what it means to take up the Christian's cross, to carry our cross. No, it really doesn't. Because he was compelled to do this. And the Christian cross that we're going to use the rest of our time tonight to talk about is a voluntary service. Something that we're not forced to do. Not something that laid on us without our consent, but it is something that we choose. Now, I mentioned the internet earlier and all the great things out there. One of the great things on the internet is a site called Quora, being a little facetious there. If you want to know anything about anything, you can go there and you won't find the right answer. But what you will find, and the reason that I'm going to quote it, is you will find what people are thinking. Now, this is just like a huge think tank, and as far as I know, anybody can submit answers, and I think they can rank answers. And so if you give an answer that a lot of people agree with, maybe your answer goes up. But on there, we get a pretty good sampling of what most people think it means to take up your cross and to follow Jesus, or what the Christian's cross is all about. And so you'll have something like some sort of a trial or hardship that you just have to get through. And all of these are going to sound very similar, and they're basically saying the same thing: difficulty, challenge, or sadness that we must put up with. I took the top three answers: a burden or obstacle to deal with. And if you've ever heard anybody use the expression, well, everybody's got their cross to bear, this is what they're talking about. This is generally what is meant. Something bad happens to you. You're going through some sort of a suffering in your life that you didn't ask for, and you just got to bear your cross. Another source that you can rank it if you think it's better or worse than Quora is Google's version of AI. And I asked her or him, I don't know what it is, what does it mean to take up your cross, or what is the Christian's cross? And this is the answer, the brief answer. It went on a lot more in detail, but something painful and difficult that is a duty one must carry out. Do you notice something about all of those answers? They speak of things that you must do, things that just come upon you, things that you have no choice about. But I want you to compare that with what Jesus said. Go back to Luke chapter 9 with me. Now, we're going to get to verse 23 in just a moment, but I want you to back up to verse 22. Peter has just answered when Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" "You are the Christ of God," verse 20. Verse 21, he strictly warned and commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the third day." That's verse 22. Then, verse 23. Then he said to them all, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." Jesus had just said that he is going to be killed and be raised the third day. And now he says, if you want to follow me where? Where are you going, Jesus? He just told him where he was going. He's going to die. If you want to follow me, you take up your cross and you come after me. Now you say, well, but does he really mean that we're going to have to die? Well, verse 24 says, "For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it." Yes, that's exactly what he means. That we have to die. I remember the first time thinking about this passage in this regard, of the idea of taking up a cross. That's an instrument of death. That is the means of execution of the day. That might be something akin to, take up your electric chair and follow me. And I realized, no, that's not what it means. Because we have gone in America, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but we've gone to great lengths. Maybe it's not a great thing. We've gone to great lengths to make sure that people who are executed don't suffer. And so we try to come up with the most quick, the most painless, the most easy type of death that you can imagine. And that's how we choose to execute people. That's fine. But understand, that's not the cross. The Romans didn't wonder, well, what can we do to make it quick and painless? They had that option. They beheaded people. That's what was reserved for Roman citizens. If you were a Roman citizen and you were sentenced to death, they would cut your head off. And that was good for you because you didn't suffer, at least not long. The cross was the exact opposite. It was designed to torture you while you die. When you think about modern executions, it's a private affair. They let some family, they let maybe the victim's family, some other media may be able to go in there. But this was not a private affair. It was very public. They would do it just right by the road so that everybody that passed by could see and feared. And on the occasion that we see Jesus hanging on the cross, ridicule and mock and belittle. So no, this isn't like our execution. So if I'm thinking about taking up my form of execution and I'm thinking about modern execution, no, that's not it. It's going to be painful. It's sometimes going to be humiliating. Although as Jesus goes through this process, you say he was just humiliated. I don't think he was. A good brother, friend of mine, a number of years ago made the point that you cannot humiliate a humble man. And so I think he was right. I don't think Jesus was humiliated, but they were trying. And they'll try to do that for us as well. So what does it mean then to take up our cross? I think most of you probably have an idea of where we're going or already understand this, but we need to be reminded of things. To take up our cross, it's an understanding that sin requires the sentence of death. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 17, when God told Adam, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day you eat it, you shall surely die. He wasn't kidding. It wasn't just a vain threat. So in Genesis chapter 3, when Eve and Adam then ate the fruit, you know what they did? They died. Now they wouldn't die physically for some time to come, but they both died spiritually that day. They were separated from God. Like Isaiah 59 verses 1 and 2 kind of bear that out. That our sins separate us from God. What happened to Adam and Eve that day? They were cast out of the garden, out of the presence of God. What was very good at the end of Genesis chapter 1 and verse 31, including the relationship of man and God, was no longer very good. And as you come on down through Genesis, you get to chapter 6, and sin has just permeated the entire world to the point that God says, I'm going to destroy all of it. Sin brings forth death. We understand that Romans chapter 6, verse 23 says the wages of sin is death. So, as a sinner, I must die. And it's something that Jesus says here, we're going to take up our cross. Now, Jesus was falsely accused. We're not falsely accused. We've all sinned. And so we have to take up that cross. As you come over to Romans chapter 6, you see Paul going into great detail, really, in describing this process of death that takes place. Now, chapter 5, verse 12 talks about death spreading to all men because all sinned. And there's that death, that separation from God. You come to chapter 6, and he talks about the man of sin, or this, as we read there in verse 4, therefore we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we've been united together in the likeness of his death, certainly we also shall be in the likeness of his resurrection, knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin. And he continues on there talking about how as a new creation, we don't continue to practice sin. Sin doesn't rule over us anymore. We've been delivered from that slavery. But in verse 16, to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one slave to whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness. So we can comfort ourselves and think, well, I've been baptized. I've done what he says here. But are you continuing to present yourselves, your members, as slaves of righteousness, or have we gone back into that life of sin? Romans chapter 12 and verse 1 says that we're to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, to the Lord. But a brother said one time the problem with a living sacrifice is he can choose to crawl off the altar anytime he wants. And that's right. We've got to stay there. That old man has to be kept dead. And I think perhaps that's what is meant when Jesus goes on to talk about the fact that we've got to take up that cross daily. I understand some translations don't have the word daily supplied there, but as you look through all that's said in the New Testament, surely we understand that this is a daily process. Paul would talk about himself dying daily. I think he's maybe pointing back to this idea here. When you wake up tomorrow, do you think it's possible for you to go all day without sinning? I have a lot of people answer that question when I ask them. They say no. And I think, wow, you don't think much of yourself. You don't think much of the power of Christ that works in you. We can't go 24 hours and 8 hours of that spent sleeping. You can't go that long without sinning. We should be able to. Be determined to do that. When I was a kid, there was a cartoon. I don't know if it's still on or not, but it was, I can't remember the name of it now. But it was the two characters, some of you older folks might know this, Pinky and the Brain. You remember that? And the Pinky would say, what are we going to do today? And he'd say, same thing we do every day, try to take over the world. And I think about that in regards to living as a Christian. When I wake up in the morning, I'd ask, what are you going to do today, Brad? I'm going to live for God. I'm going to overcome sin. I'm going to follow Christ. I'm going to take up my cross. I'm going to do that today. I turned 50 years old last year. I'll be 51 this year. My wife's already 51. She turned 51 today. So she's older than me. I don't know if the Lord blesses her with another 40 years. The Lord maybe bless me with another 40 years, live to be 90. Can I go 40 more years without sinning? Probably not. But I don't need to think about 40 more years. I need to think about today. What did Jesus say at the end of Matthew chapter 6 and talking about not worrying about the things in the world and all that? Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Let tomorrow worry about tomorrow. Just today, take up your cross and follow Christ. And then tomorrow, I think we want to try to do the same thing, but just worry about that tomorrow and just do it day after day after day. And before you know it, I'm not saying you're going to live a sinless life, but can we live a life of taking up our cross and following Christ? We absolutely can. Paul in Galatians chapter 2, I really would like to go into more detail as far as applications of how we can take it up. I want to look in Galatians 2 because here is one application that we see made of what Jesus talks about here. And it's in the context when he mentions Peter and Barnabas being hypocritical in their actions. In verse 11 of Galatians 2, he says, when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. So he set the scene there for us in telling us what was going on. And then he says in verse 14, when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, he begins there in verse 14, if you being a Jew live in the manner of Gentiles, but that goes all the way down to verse 21 and includes verse 20. So when Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, and the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul's not just writing that in a letter to the Galatians. That's what he said to Peter when Peter was to be blamed because he was being a hypocrite, because he was letting the traditions of his religious past get the best of him and thinking, well, I want to hold on to a little bit of that, or maybe his reputation in Jerusalem is going to be harmed if they go back and say, well, we went up there and found Peter. And Paul says, look, Peter, I've been crucified with Christ. Don't you see that the implication as he's talking to Peter is, haven't you also? Didn't you determine that you were going to do this too? What happened to you, Peter? Well, on this occasion, I tell you, Peter put it down. And the consequences of putting our cross down is terrible. If you go back to Luke chapter 9, we sometimes I read this passage and I read 23 through 25. We didn't really read 25. What profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and is himself destroyed or lost? That's really where we could get into some of the applications and, what is it that you would exchange your soul for? But I haven't often read 26 in connection with it, but we need to. For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in his own glory and in his Father's and of the holy angels. There have been people that I've known, and I go up and, hey, Andrew. Andrew's like, I don't know you. Who are you? And that's kind of embarrassing. But that's okay if it happens in this world because, I don't have a memorable face or name or anything. So if people don't remember me or know my name, that's okay. But if I get to heaven and Jesus says, I don't know you, and that's it's not embarrassing at that point. It's eternal destruction. It's where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. It's where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's where there's utter darkness and at the same time eternal fire. And I don't know how to wrap my head around all of that, but I know it's not where God is. It's not where the Lamb is. And if I don't take up my cross daily and follow Jesus, it's not where I'm going. And so I encourage you tonight, if there's anything going on in your life, maybe you've never taken up the cross. We didn't spend a lot of time on it, but if you go back to Romans chapter 6, Paul's not writing there to tell the Romans what they need to do to become a Christian. He's writing to Christians, reminding them of what they've done. But if you, in reading that, realize, I haven't done that, then why not do that tonight? Pick up your cross tonight and follow Jesus. Or if along the way it got heavy and difficult and hard and you suffered and you decided that you were going to set it down for a time, why not pick it back up? We're going to sing a song of invitation. It's a very fitting song, number 887, Kneel at the Cross. You can't kneel at the cross unless you first have taken up your cross. If there's anything we can do to help you tonight, let us know while together we stand. One,